They say funerals bury the past, but sometimes they bury the living too. My own father mocked me in front of mourners, reducing my service to nothing but a cruel punchline. But silent revenge waits in the shadows. Brutal revenge sharpens in silence. Justice revenge never forgets. That day, humiliation became fuel, and in court, the silence finally shattered. My name is Captain Victoria Hale. I am 37 years old, and I have worn the uniform of the United States Army for 15 years. Most people never knew what I did because my missions were written in codes and erased in silence. But my father, retired Major General Victor Hale, knew. And at my comrade's funeral, with rows of white headstones glowing under a gray sky, he chose to humiliate me in front of everyone. He gripped the podium with hands that had signed more orders than he had fired rounds, his chest covered in ribbons polished for the cameras. His voice rang out with the kind of authority that once moved battalions. "This tragedy," he said, letting his eyes settle on me like a sniper's sight, "is the failure of those who couldn't lead. Those too weak to hold the line." His words cut through the silence sharper than any eulogy, and I knew every officer, every grieving family, every reporter with a pen in hand heard what he was really saying. His daughter was a disgrace. I stood at attention, boots rooted to the earth, spine unbending, face unreadable. But inside, I was ice. He thought shame would break me. He thought public humiliation would erase the truth. What he didn't see was the thin drive tucked inside the pocket of my jacket. What he didn't know was that I held a recording with his voice on it, proof that he had abandoned an entire unit in the desert. Proof that the blood on this ground wasn't from weakness. It was from his pen. That's the kind of betrayal that doesn't just sting, it brands you. And when it comes from your own father, a man who built his empire on medals and lies, it does something else too. It makes you cold. Cold enough to wait. Cold enough to strike when the world least expects it. I didn't blink. I didn't let my breath hitch. He looked at me as if he had already won. But in that exact moment, under the flag snapping above us, I decided something. This funeral wouldn't bury my reputation. It would bury his legacy. Welcome to Hidden Vengeance. If you've ever been silenced, if you've ever carried the weight of betrayal and dreamed of justice served cold, you are in the right place. Like, subscribe, and stay with me, because this story will take you into the shadows of power and show you how the truth can destroy an empire. The crowd heard a general blaming ghosts. What they didn't hear, what only I knew, was that his empire had cracks no metal could cover. And once I opened my mouth, the weight of the silence he created would collapse on him, crushing everything he thought untouchable. The funeral was just the first shot fired. The battlefield was shifting, and soon the walls of a courtroom would replace the headstones. The same voice that condemned me would be played back for the world to hear. The same man who mocked me would find himself cornered. And the question that haunted me that day wasn't whether I would win. It was how far the truth would spread once I unleashed it, because silence doesn't last forever. And the next time I spoke, his entire career would end in a single breath. What none of them knew, what even he didn't suspect, was that the funeral was only the prologue. The real war, the one that would shatter reputations and resurrect the ghosts of Iron Dusk, was waiting just beyond the horizon, and I was ready to drag his name into the light. After the funeral, the echo of his words lingered in my ears longer than the sound of the rifles that fired into the sky. They clung to me like smoke after a fire, the kind you can't scrub from your skin. He had stripped me down in front of everyone, but humiliation wasn't new. My father had always found a way to take the weight of my service and turn it into air. 15 years in psychological operations, 15 years walking lines between truth and deception meant nothing to him because I wasn't the one charging into gunfire with medals to prove it. To him, the work of shadows wasn't soldiering. To me, it was survival. I can still see the narrow corridor of iron dusk in my mind, dust so thick it stained your lungs, silence broken only by static on the comms. The mission didn't make the reports. The families never received the full stories. Officially, it was stamped support role and tucked away like it never happened. But I remember the names. Sergeant Cole, who kept a deck of cards in his chest pocket and played games with us in the dark to keep our minds from breaking. Lieutenant Rivers, always bent over a map, sketching routes with a dull pencil until the lead snapped. Mira, braiding her hair even when the nights made no promises of tomorrow. They weren't erased from my memory. They were carved into it. And every time I sat across from my father at a dinner table, and he asked why I hadn't moved up to command, I thought of them. He wanted brass and rank. I wanted breath and survival. When he introduced me at that funeral as background noise, what he really did was tell the world my silence meant nothing. What he never realized was that silence is not emptiness. Silence holds. It carries the unspeakable. And in that silence, I had kept something he couldn't imagine, a recording that bore his voice, a recording that carried the moment he abandoned them, the moment he decided an entire unit was expendable. I've listened to it enough to know every tick of static before his order drops like a blade. Abort extraction. Asset no longer viable. Pull out. People assume betrayal comes with shouting, with rage. But his betrayal came in a calm tone, the kind you'd use to order a drink, and it killed more than bullets ever could. I stayed cold because cold is the only way to live when the truth burns. I learned to read the room by the way hands tightened on glass, by the way eyes slid away when someone remembered too much. That's how you survive in shadows. And that's why I knew my father's empire was built on cracks. Every smile, every medal, every handshake with contractors and senators, none of it could erase his signature on that order. That was his true legacy, and I carried it with me, waiting for the moment to use it. Stories like this aren't just mine. They belong to anyone who has been silenced, anyone who has had their worth dismissed by someone in power. If you feel that sting, if you've carried secrets that deserve the light, then share this story. Let it travel further than his lies ever did. Because silence becomes power only when it spreads. I left that funeral with his words pressing on me like a weight, but beneath that weight was steel. The families saw a general honoring sacrifice. I saw the man who ordered it erased, and the deeper question, the one that pulsed with every step I took away from those graves, wasn't whether he'd be exposed. It was whether the world could handle the truth once I opened the door. Because once released, it wouldn't stop at him. It would consume every name tied to iron dusk, every signature that buried us. And I was ready to be the spark. The night I chose to use the recording, the weight of it pressed heavier on me than body armor. I remember the hum of fluorescent lights in the hall, the shuffle of boots against polished floors, the smell of stale coffee in the air. Every sound carried a pulse, like the world itself was holding its breath. My father sat in the front row at the gala, his chin lifted, his glass raised as if nothing in his empire could crack. And that was the moment I walked on stage. I didn't offer greetings. I didn't smile. My boots echoed once, twice, and then I stood at the microphone. The air grew still, not respectful still, but watchful, the kind of silence before a storm breaks. My father's smirk was small, almost invisible, but I saw it. He thought I was about to play his game. He thought humiliation would end with me bowing my head. He didn't notice the drive tucked inside my jacket, the proof I carried like a live grenade. The first note I sang wasn't beautiful. It wasn't meant to be. It was raw, jagged, a blade dragged against glass. Heads turned. Forks stopped midway to mouths. The melody carried words that weren't supposed to exist, lines of a forbidden anthem buried with men and women who had vanished without funerals, without names. The audience leaned forward, not because of me, but because memory had just walked into the room uninvited. And then came the crack in the air. A chair scraped. A voice cut through the silence. Stop. It was General Barrett, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, rising to his feet with his eyes locked on my father. That song, he said, his voice low, belongs to Echo 17. I saw my father's hand tighten on his glass until the stem almost snapped, his face drained to ash, the mask slipping in front of hundreds of witnesses. He didn't need to speak. His silence was confession enough. For the first time in my life, he couldn't hide behind his medals. He couldn't spin my voice into weakness. He was cornered, not by me, but by the ghosts he tried to erase. And I knew then, I had him. The proof wasn't only in the song. It was in the paper trail I'd collected, in the signature that bore his name, the same slanted signature he used on my academy recommendation letter. He had signed me into the army, and years later, he had signed my unit out of life. That symmetry was the knife I carried, and I was ready to twist it. I didn't need to tell the audience what I knew. I let the silence hang, let them see him wilt under the weight of recognition. That's what true revenge looks like. Not rage, not shouting, but exposure. Cold, deliberate exposure. It was the kind of silence no one forgets. And when you've carried betrayal for years, silence becomes sharper than any bullet. If stories like this cut through your chest, if you've ever tasted humiliation and longed for the moment truth speaks louder than lies, then like this video and subscribe. Let the power of silence, of cold, calculated revenge, reach further than the ones who tried to bury it. The room never returned to normal that night. Once you've heard the voice of the erased, you can't pretend it was never there. But the real strike hadn't landed yet. That would come when I laid the recording on the table in a closed-door inquiry, and the generals who thought they buried the past were forced to face the living proof in my hands. The hearing room was colder than any desert night I had survived, not from temperature, but from the way history pressed itself against the walls. The oak table stretched like a battlefield trench, polished until it reflected every fluorescent light above. 3 men sat across from me, the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs, a Pentagon lawyer, and a general whose eyes never left the folder at his fingertips. My boots made no sound as I crossed the carpet, but every step carried the weight of the ghosts I had brought with me. I sat without being asked. Silence filled the space, not awkward but electric, and I knew they were waiting to see if I would break it. I didn't. The vice chair slid a file across the table, its red tab like a warning flare. "Captain Hale," he said, "this anthem you sang, it was never authorized. It should not exist. And yet, you knew every word. How?" His voice was calm, precise, but I could hear the fracture beneath it. I let the question hang a beat too long, forcing him to feel the silence he'd tried to bury. My hand stayed still in my lap, but my voice came low and steady. Because I was there. The air snapped. The lawyer's pen slipped against the page. The general's jaw tightened. They had expected me to admit hearsay, to claim memory from rumor, not to claim survival. The vice chair leaned forward slowly. "Our records show only 2 survivors from Echo 17. His eyes sharpened on me like a scalpel. "Are you saying you were the 3rd? I held his stare. "Yes, sir." And I didn't just survive. I carried the proof. I pulled the drive from my jacket and set it on the table with a click that sounded louder than gunfire. The lawyer's hand hovered, then hesitated, as though touching it might scorch his skin. The vice chair gestured and the recording played. Static. Then my father's voice, calm as glass. "Abort extraction. Asset no longer viable. Pull out the words filled the chamber, slicing through the polished stillness like shrapnel. No one moved. No one breathed. It was the kind of silence that only comes when lies collapse under their own weight. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't need to. I watched their faces instead. The lawyer's lips parted, but no sound came. The general's hands clenched into fists on the table. The vice chair leaned back, his eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in recognition. He had heard that tone before, the tone of a man ordering lives erased as if they were equations to be solved. "Whose signature approved this?" he asked, though I could tell he already knew. I slid the final sheet across the table. The ink hadn't faded. My father's slanted handwriting arched across the page like a scar. I spoke evenly, almost clinical. He signed me into the army. And then he signed my unit out of life. The room absorbed the words like a body taking a bullet. For a moment, no one could speak, and that silence was the verdict. The lawyer finally cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but his voice cracked. "Do you understand what this means, Captain?" I leaned forward just enough for my words to land. "It means silence didn't erase us." Silence became my weapon. The hearing ended without ceremony, but I didn't need ceremony. I had detonated the truth in a room built to contain it. And once truth explodes, you can't sweep the rubble back into order. As I left, the hallway lights flickered against the glass walls, each reflection showing me a different version of myself. The soldier, the survivor, the accuser, the heir. But one question burned sharper than the rest. Once his empire cracked in private, how long before the world outside saw it collapse in full daylight? The downfall of Victor Hale didn't happen with a single explosion. It was slower, sharper, like glass splintering under steady pressure until the whole pane finally gives way. Within days of the inquiry, whispers turned into leaks. Reporters started circling his name, asking questions about units that never appeared in official logs, about orders stamped with his signature that no one had dared to challenge before. His phone stopped ringing with invitations to galas and golf outings. Old allies went silent, afraid their association would drag them down too. And when the first article hit the front page, his legacy cracked wide open. I watched from a distance, not out of fear, but precision. This wasn't the kind of revenge you scream about. This was the kind you feed quietly until it consumes everything it touches. Photographs of him once draped in medals now sat next to headlines that read words like cover-up, erasure, and betrayal. The proud man who once commanded entire rooms with his presence now appeared on television with his eyes hollow, his jaw tight, denying what the evidence already screamed. And the more he denied, the more people recognized the truth. But justice didn't stop at headlines. A Senate review opened. Cameras flashed outside marble steps as senators grilled the Department of Defense about black operations and hidden casualties. My father's name wasn't just whispered in classified corridors anymore. It was etched into the record as the man who signed away lives and then tried to bury them under silence. His voice, once steady enough to direct entire battalions, trembled when he finally appeared before the panel. He tried to cloak himself in patriotism, in sacrifice, in words about the greater good. But the recording didn't care about spin. The ink on his orders didn't bend under excuses. They were as permanent as the graves that bore no names. I didn't testify with anger. I didn't need to. I testified with facts, with dates, with the names of men and women he had erased. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of his reputation. Senators leaned forward. Cameras caught every twitch in his expression. The room that once bowed to him now judged him in silence. And there was no applause when I stepped down, only the heavy recognition that truth had finally cut through. When the verdict landed, it wasn't shouted. It was printed, signed, sealed, pension stripped, contracts revoked, honors rescinded. My father, once draped in glory, reduced to a man no company would touch, no colleague would stand beside. He had built his empire on silence, but silence had turned on him. That's when I made my move. With his influence collapsing, his defense consulting firm slipped into chaos. Shareholders panicked, stocks dropped, and that's when I stepped in. Not as his daughter, not as a soldier, but as the strategist he never believed I could be. I bought the controlling stake, piece by piece, until the company bore my name. And then I gutted it, reshaped it, rebuilt it into something he never could have imagined, a foundation dedicated to the veterans who had been erased, the ones who never had voices in rooms like this. The empire he thought would secure his name became the monument to the people he tried to forget. I stood in the boardroom on the day the papers were finalized, glass windows stretching out over the city. The skyline glowed with dusk, every light flickering like a reminder of what power really is. My reflection looked back at me, not the daughter mocked at funerals, not the officer dismissed as background noise, but the woman who turned silence into a weapon sharp enough to cut down a general. My father thought he could bury me under humiliation. He thought he could erase my service with a smile and a cruel line. But humiliation became memory, and memory became evidence, and evidence became power. In the end, I didn't just survive his betrayal, I owned it. And as I watched the city lights burn against the night, one truth echoed louder than any anthem. He thought I was just a song, but now I own the company he built on silence. The story of my father's fall wasn't just about him. It was about what silence can carry when you refuse to let it be broken. He believed erasing names would erase the truth, that burying the past meant it would never rise again. But silence is never empty. It waits, it sharpens, it remembers. And when the time is right, it cuts deeper than any weapon. I stood in that boardroom overlooking the city, the night sky bleeding into glass and steel. The company that once carried his name now bore mine. What he tried to build as a monument to himself had become a refuge for the forgotten, the erased, the ones who never got their due. It wasn't revenge born of rage. It was justice born of discipline, of patience, of preparation. And that was the lesson. You don't need to shout to win. Sometimes the strongest revenge is in the silence you keep, the evidence you protect, the moment you choose to strike. So I'll ask you this. When betrayal comes, when someone tries to erase your worth, do you let them control the silence? Or do you hold it, sharpen it, and wait until the truth speaks louder than their lies? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know how you see justice. If this story reached you, if it left a mark the way betrayal leaves scars, then join me here. Subscribe, not just to hear more, but to be part of a place where silence isn't weakness, it's power. Thank you for walking with me through this story. Thank you for noticing the details others turn away from. The truth remains because you were willing to bear witness.